The musket was found nearly 8 feet beneath the streets of Vienna, buried under layers of burned timber, shattered stone, and blackened earth, its barrel warped by heat and its wooden stock eaten away by centuries underground. But what unsettled historians was not the rust or the damage. It was the fact that the weapon appeared to have been fired over and over again until the metal itself began to crack apart under pressure, as if whoever carried it had refused to stop shooting even while the city around him was collapsing. For years, the artifact sat quietly inside a museum archive, labeled as nothing more than a deteriorated 17th-century flintlock from the Siege of Vienna, another forgotten object from another forgotten war. Yet hidden beneath the corrosion were marks that told a far darker story, one connected to panic, exhaustion, smoke-choked streets, and the final hours of men who believed they were about to witness the end of their world. Most people imagine old wars as distant paintings, rows of bright uniforms standing proudly beneath fluttering banners, while kings and generals move armies across maps. But the reality inside Vienna in 1683 was something else entirely. Behind those walls were tens of thousands of civilians, trapped inside a shrinking city where church bells rang through clouds of ash, where exhausted defenders slept beside loaded muskets, and where every night brought the sound of digging beneath the streets as enemy sappers tunneled toward the foundations below. The musket you are looking at survived all of it. It survived the smoke, the fear, the collapsing barricades, and the silence that came afterward, when entire neighborhoods were reduced to ruins. And somehow, after more than 300 years beneath the ground, it still carries the memory of those final, desperate weeks. Historians often describe the siege as a turning point in European history, a clash between empires that shaped the future of the continent. But they rarely describe what it actually felt like to stand inside the city while the horizon burned red at night, and rumors spread that the walls would not last another week. They rarely talk about the civilians who melted down household metal to make ammunition, or the young defenders handed heavy muskets despite barely knowing how to fire them. They rarely describe the smell of black powder lingering in the air day and night until it seeped into clothing, food, and skin. But this weapon tells a different story, a more human story, a far more terrifying one. Because this rusted musket was not simply a tool of war. It was a witness to the slow suffocation of a city that believed it had been abandoned by the world. And by the end of this story, you may understand why some historians quietly avoided speaking in detail about what truly happened behind the walls of Vienna during those final weeks of the siege. If you enjoy forgotten war stories, lost relics, and the darker side of history that rarely appears in textbooks, make sure to subscribe and let me know in the comments what historical artifact you think carries the heaviest story of all. Because tonight, we are going back to a city that stood on the edge of destruction, while one rusted musket waited in the smoke. In the summer of 1683, Vienna still believed its walls could save it. The city stood at the heart of the Habsburg Empire like a stone fortress untouched by the chaos consuming Eastern Europe, its cathedral towers rising above crowded streets filled with merchants, blacksmiths, priests, and soldiers returning from distant border wars. Travelers arriving from the West described Vienna as disciplined, wealthy, and proud, a city where music drifted from taverns at night while church bells echoed across narrow alleyways before dawn. But beyond the markets and candlelit homes, fear was already beginning to spread. For months, refugees had been arriving from villages farther east, exhausted families carrying stories of smoke rising over abandoned farms, and entire communities fleeing ahead of an army that seemed impossible to stop. Some claimed they had seen endless columns of men stretching across the horizon for miles. Others whispered about cannons so large they shook the ground before they even fired. Yet inside Vienna, many still convinced themselves the danger was exaggerated. The city had survived threats before. It had thick walls, experienced commanders, and enough supplies to endure a siege, or so people hoped. But every morning, the atmosphere grew heavier. Storefronts began boarding up their windows. churches filled with anxious civilians kneeling in silence. Wagons loaded with grain, tools, and furniture rattled through the gates as noble families quietly prepared to leave while they still could. The emperor himself departed the city before the siege truly began, a decision that shattered morale more than many later admitted. To the people remaining behind, it felt as though Vienna had suddenly been left alone. Among those still inside the city was a young apprentice named Lucas, the son of a cooper who repaired barrels near the Danube Canal. He was barely old enough to shave and had never fought in a battle, yet by July he found himself standing among other frightened boys in a crowded square, while exhausted officers distributed outdated weapons from city armories. Some received pikes, others received rusting pistols or worn swords. Lucas was handed a heavy flintlock musket with dark stains along the wooden stock and iron fittings rough from years of neglect. The weapon smelled faintly of oil and smoke even before it had been loaded. He struggled just to lift it properly. Around him, older men muttered prayers while black powder was measured into paper cartridges under the dim light of lanterns. No one spoke confidently anymore. Rumors moved through Vienna faster than official orders. Some said relief armies were marching toward the city. Others claimed the defenders would be overwhelmed within days. Every conversation seemed to end the same way, with uneasy silence and distant glances toward the eastern horizon. Then came the first reports that enemy cavalry had appeared beyond the outskirts. Farmers abandoning the countryside poured through the gates with carts piled high with blankets, livestock, and crying children. Guards slammed the gates shut behind them, while workers reinforced barricades with timber and stone. Soon, the air itself began to change. Smoke from burned villages drifted over the walls in long gray clouds that turned sunsets deep red across the rooftops of Vienna. At night, Lucas sat awake beside the Musket in his family's cramped apartment, listening to church bells ringing through the darkness, while somewhere beyond the walls, thousands upon thousands of men continued moving closer. The first cannon fire reached Vienna before sunrise. Lucas remembered waking to a deep vibration rolling through the floorboards beneath his family's apartment, followed seconds later by distant thunder echoing across the city walls. At first, nobody moved. The sound seemed unreal, like a storm trapped somewhere beyond the horizon. Then came another blast, louder this time, shaking dust from the ceiling beams while dogs barked wildly in the streets below. By morning, smoke already hung over parts of the eastern district. Crowds gathered near churches and public wells, speaking in hushed voices, while soldiers hurried along the roads carrying powder kegs, tools, and bundles of timber toward the fortifications. The siege had begun. From the walls, the defenders could finally see the vast encampment surrounding the city. Endless rows of tents stretched across the countryside beneath clouds of drifting smoke, interrupted by banners snapping in the wind and lines of artillery being dragged into position. Fires burned through the night beyond the city, so numerous that some witnesses later claimed the hills themselves looked alive with orange light. Lucas stood beside older militia recruits, near one of the outer barricades, gripping the musket so tightly his hands cramped around the worn wood. The weapon felt heavier every day. He had spent hours practicing how to load it, fumbling with powder and shot, while veterans barked corrections beside him. Pour the powder, ram the ball, prime the pan, keep your hands steady. But nothing prepared him for the sound. Whenever the cannons fired, the entire city seemed to tense like a living thing under pressure. Windows rattled, birds scattered into the smoke. Children cried somewhere in the distance while church bells rang constantly, as if trying to hold the city together through noise alone. During the day, Lucas carried buckets of water and ammunition between defensive positions, while officers shouted orders through crowded streets thick with ash and sawdust. Blacksmiths worked without rest, repairing damaged weapons and reshaping scrap metal into bullets. Bakers rationed bread under armed supervision. Priests moved through the city blessing frightened civilians huddled inside cathedrals lit by flickering candles. Yet beneath all the activity was a growing sense of suffocation. The gates remained closed. No one could leave. Vienna had become a trapped world surrounded by enemies and smoke. At night, Lucas returned home exhausted, his ears ringing from cannon fire that rarely stopped completely. Sometimes his mother sat silently near the window, clutching prayer beads, while his younger sister slept beside bundles of packed belongings they no longer had any place to carry. The musket rested against the wall near the doorway, always loaded now, always close enough to reach in seconds. One evening, Lucas noticed fresh scratches near the trigger guard, marks likely left by another frightened hand years earlier, during some forgotten border war. He wondered who had carried the weapon before him. Had they survived? Had they also sat awake listening to distant artillery while waiting for walls to fail? Outside, Vienna darkened beneath layers of smoke, drifting through the streets like fog. The smell of sulfur and burned wood clung to clothing and skin until even drinking water tasted faintly bitter. Then came the rumors that unsettled the defenders more than the cannons themselves. Men whispered that enemy engineers were digging beneath the city, carving tunnels underground toward the walls. Some claimed they could already hear faint scraping sounds below certain districts late at night. Others insisted entire sections of fortification could vanish in an instant if explosives were planted beneath them. Soon, even sleep became impossible. Every creak beneath the floorboards made people freeze in silence, listening carefully to the earth below Vienna. By August, the rhythm of life inside Vienna no longer followed the rising and setting of the sun. It followed the artillery. Every morning began with the same distant thunder rolling across the walls, followed by tremors beneath the streets as cannonballs smashed into stone ramparts and rooftops somewhere beyond sight. Sleep came only in fragments now. Lucas often woke disoriented in the darkness, unsure whether the shaking beneath him came from explosions above ground or from the tunneling below. Entire sections of the city had begun changing shape under the pressure of the siege. Streets once crowded with merchants and musicians were now blocked with overturned wagons, broken furniture, and hastily built barricades. Smoke drifted constantly between buildings, trapping the smell of burned wood, wet earth, and black powder over the city like a suffocating blanket. The defenders had settled into a terrifying routine. During the day, men repaired damaged walls while exhausted militia units rotated between defensive posts, carrying muskets blackened from constant use. At night, they listened. That was the part Lucas feared most. Listening. Beneath the city, enemy engineers continued digging toward Vienna's foundations with patient determination. Sometimes the scraping sounds were faint, almost imagined. Other nights they seemed frighteningly close, echoing through cellars and underground storage rooms where civilians huddled beside candles, praying for the walls to survive another dawn. Special crews worked underground, trying to locate the tunnels before explosives could be planted beneath key defenses. Entire teams disappeared for hours beneath the streets carrying picks, lanterns, and barrels of sand to dampen vibrations. Those who returned often emerged pale and silent, refusing to describe what they had heard below the earth. One evening, Lucas was assigned to carry powder and water to a defensive position overlooking part of the outer wall. Rain had fallen earlier, turning the streets slick with mud and ash. Fires still smoldered in nearby buildings damaged by bombardment, their orange glow flickering across smoke-covered stone. As he climbed the stairs toward the battlements, he saw men sleeping upright beside loaded weapons, too exhausted even to remove their helmets. Others sat silently, staring into the darkness beyond the walls, where countless campfires burned in the distance like a second city surrounding Vienna. No one spoke confidently anymore. Even the officers had begun lowering their voices. Lucas kept the musket close at all times now. The wood had grown rougher from sweat and damp weather, and dark residue coated parts of the barrel no matter how carefully he cleaned it. He had become strangely attached to the weapon, not because it made him feel powerful, but because it gave him something solid to hold while the world around him slowly unraveled. Every time the ground shook, his fingers instinctively tightened around the stock. Every distant shout in the darkness made him reach for it without thinking. The city itself seemed exhausted. Food grew scarcer each week. Long lines formed before sunrise outside bakeries guarded by armed men trying to prevent panic. Wells became crowded gathering points where frightened civilians traded rumors in hushed voices while watching smoke drift overhead. Some claimed relief forces were only days away. Others whispered that Vienna would fall before help ever arrived. Yet the most unsettling thing was not the hunger or even the bombardment. It was the feeling that the city was slowly sinking into fear from the inside. One night, shortly before dawn, Lucas was jolted awake by a low rumble unlike anything he had heard before. Windows shattered nearby. Dust burst from the ceiling beams as terrified voices echoed through the street below. Somewhere beneath the walls, the earth itself had exploded. The explosion beneath the walls changed Vienna overnight. What had once felt like a distant siege suddenly became immediate, intimate, and terrifyingly close. Entire sections of the city awoke choking on dust as church bells rang wildly through the darkness, and soldiers rushed toward the damaged defenses, carrying lanterns through clouds of smoke. Lucas followed alongside militia units, moving through narrow streets littered with shattered roof tiles and splintered timber. Even before reaching the walls, he could feel the fear spreading through the defenders like cold water. People no longer whispered about tunnels beneath the city. They knew the tunnels were there now. They had heard the earth erupt beneath them. In the days that followed, the bombardment intensified. The walls still stood, but everyone inside Vienna understood they were slowly being hollowed out from below. Sleep disappeared almost completely. Civilians and soldiers alike became trapped in a constant state of tension, where every vibration beneath the streets caused heads to turn in silence. Lucas noticed how quickly people had begun changing. Men who once joked beside campfires now sat quietly, staring into nothing, while cleaning muskets with trembling hands. Priests moved constantly between defensive positions, offering prayers to exhausted defenders whose faces had become gray with fatigue. Food shortages worsened each week. Bread was thinner now, darker and rougher, often mixed with whatever grain remained in storage. Long before sunrise, lines stretched through the streets as civilians waited silently beside empty baskets, hoping supplies had not run out. Some families boiled leather scraps and roots gathered from abandoned gardens just to quiet the pain in their stomachs. The smell inside Vienna had changed too. Smoke still lingered everywhere, but now it mixed with damp earth, sweat, mildew, and stagnant water trapped beneath overcrowded buildings. Even the cathedral squares no longer felt sacred. They felt heavy, oppressive, as though the entire city had become one enormous waiting room where everyone sensed disaster approaching, but no longer knew when it would arrive. Lucas spent most days near the fortifications, carrying powder and ammunition, while helping reinforce damaged positions with sacks of dirt and broken timber. The musket rarely left his side anymore. Its barrel had darkened from constant firing drills, and the flint mechanism sometimes jammed from moisture and grime. Yet he trusted it more than the city itself. Some nights he fell asleep gripping the stock against his chest while distant cannon fire echoed through the streets like rolling thunder. But the worst moments came during the quiet hours between bombardments. That silence unsettled everyone. Without cannon fire or shouted orders, people could hear smaller sounds returning to the city. Coughing behind apartment walls, crying children, boots scraping across stone, and beneath it all, faint vibrations from underground. Digging. Always digging. One evening, Lucas joined a small group assigned to deliver supplies into a cellar being used by tunnel listening crews beneath the walls. The air underground felt damp and suffocating, illuminated only by weak candlelight reflecting off wet stone. Several exhausted men sat motionless beside the dirt walls, pressing metal cups against the ground, listening for movement beneath them. Nobody spoke above a whisper. Lucas remembered one older engineer slowly raising his hand for silence before everyone froze completely. At first, there was nothing. Then came the sound. A faint scraping somewhere below the earth. Rhythmic, patient, human. Lucas felt his stomach tighten as the engineer quietly crossed himself without saying a word. In that moment, the siege no longer felt like armies fighting beyond walls. It felt as though Vienna itself was being hunted from underneath. By early September, Vienna no longer resembled the confident imperial capital it had once been. The city had become darker, quieter, and exhausted in ways that frightened even the defenders themselves. Entire neighborhoods remained covered in soot from repeated bombardments, while shattered rooftops exposed wooden beams blackened by smoke and rain. The streets were crowded not with merchants or musicians anymore, but with men carrying buckets of sand, wounded defenders limping toward churches converted into aid stations, and civilians moving silently through the haze with hollow expressions and lowered eyes. Lucas barely recognized the city he had grown up in. Every day felt narrower, heavier, and more dangerous than the last. The underground war had become the true nightmare of the siege. Explosions beneath the walls now came with terrifying regularity, each one shaking nearby buildings hard enough to crack plaster and send clouds of dust pouring through stairwells and cellars. Defenders rushed constantly to reinforce weakened sections of fortification before another tunnel collapsed beneath them. Some areas near the outer walls had become so unstable that entire families abandoned nearby homes and crowded into churches farther inside the city. But nowhere truly felt safe anymore. Even deep indoors, people listened nervously to the floor beneath their feet. Lucas had begun serving night watches near one of the threatened bastions, where defenders feared another underground explosion might come at any moment. The hours before dawn were always the worst. Cold mist drifted through the damaged walls, while exhausted soldiers huddled beside dim lanterns cleaning weapons and staring into darkness beyond the fortifications. The musket rested across Lucas's knees during those long, silent hours, its iron barrel icy beneath his hands. He noticed how every man around him held onto his weapon differently now. Not proudly, not confidently, desperately. As if the muskets themselves had become the final barrier between order and total panic. One night, shortly after midnight, the defenders heard shouting erupt somewhere farther down the wall, followed by the sudden ringing of alarm bells. Men scrambled into position while officers ran through the smoke, shouting commands no one could fully hear over the chaos. Lucas gripped the musket and followed the others toward the disturbance, his boots slipping across wet stones slick with mud and ash. When he reached the damaged section of wall, he saw smoke rising from a newly collapsed stretch of earth near the fortifications, where another underground charge had detonated beneath the defenses. The ground itself looked torn apart. Through drifting smoke and confusion, defenders rushed to reinforce the breach before attackers could exploit the opening. For the first time since the siege began, Lucas found himself standing close enough to hear enemy voices through the haze beyond the walls. His hands shook violently as he tried to reload the musket under pressure, fingers fumbling with powder and shot, while exhausted veterans shouted for him to stay calm. Around him, the night had dissolved into confusion filled with smoke, sparks, collapsing dirt, and the constant roar of cannon fire from somewhere beyond sight. The musket fired with a violent burst that left his ears ringing and his shoulder aching beneath the recoil. He barely remembered aiming it. He only remembered the smoke swallowing everything afterward. Later, long after the chaos subsided and the defenders stabilized the damaged position, Lucas sat against the cold stone wall, struggling to steady his breathing, while dawn slowly crept over Vienna. The musket rested beside him, coated in soot and damp earth, its barrel still warm from firing. Nearby, Older soldiers stared silently toward the horizon, where countless enemy campfires still flickered beneath the gray morning sky. Nobody celebrated holding the line anymore. Nobody spoke about victory. They only spoke about surviving another night. The night Vienna nearly collapsed began with silence. Not complete silence, because the distant cannons still echoed across the darkness, and scattered fires still crackled through ruined districts. But for the first time in weeks, the bombardment briefly slowed, and that quiet unsettled the defenders far more than the noise ever had. Men along the walls stood motionless, staring into the darkness beyond the fortifications, while cold wind carried smoke through the streets in long gray waves. Lucas remembered tightening his grip around the musket, as if his hands already sensed something terrible approaching. Around midnight, the city bells began ringing again. Not the slow, mournful tolling people had grown used to during the siege, but frantic alarms spreading from tower to tower across Vienna. Somewhere near the southern defenses, shouting erupted through the smoke, followed by the unmistakable rumble of collapsing earth beneath the walls. The underground tunnels had reached their target. Lucas and the other militia defenders rushed toward the breach through streets lit only by firelight and lantern glow reflecting against drifting smoke. The closer they moved toward the damaged fortifications, the more chaotic the city became. Civilians carrying bundles and children pushed deeper into the inner districts, while exhausted soldiers ran in the opposite direction toward the fighting. Some men shouted prayers. Others shouted for powder and water. Nobody seemed fully in control anymore. When Lucas finally reached the breach, the sight froze him in place. Part of the outer defenses had collapsed into a massive cloud of dirt, shattered timber, and smoke that rolled across the wall like storm fog. Cannon fire flashed beyond the haze while defenders scrambled to build makeshift barricades from broken carts, beams, and overturned debris before enemy forces could push through the damaged section. The air smelled of wet earth, sulfur, sweat, and burning wood, all mixed together until breathing itself became difficult. Lucas could barely hear commands over the chaos surrounding him. The musket shook in his hands as he tried to reload beside other terrified militia recruits pressed shoulder to shoulder against the unstable barricades. Sparks drifted through the smoke while distant screams echoed somewhere behind the walls where fires had spread into nearby buildings. Every few seconds, another cannon blast illuminated the haze in flashes of orange light, turning the entire breach into a nightmare of shadows and noise. Lucas fired again and again, almost blindly through the smoke, his ears ringing so violently that the world around him began feeling unreal. The musket barrel grew dangerously hot beneath his hands. Black powder residue coated his sleeves and face, while his fingers cramped from forcing cartridges into the weapon as quickly as possible. At one point, he nearly dropped the musket after burning his palm against the overheated barrel, but he grabbed it again immediately, terrified of standing unarmed even for a second. Around him, defenders no longer looked like disciplined soldiers. They looked exhausted men fighting panic itself. Some had not slept properly in days. Others moved mechanically through the smoke with hollow expressions, loading and firing as if instinct alone kept them standing. Then came the sound Lucas would remember for the rest of his life. A deep horn blast rising somewhere beyond the smoke outside the walls, followed by thousands of voices roaring through the darkness at once. The defenders froze for one terrible moment as the sound rolled across Vienna like thunder. Even the veterans beside him looked shaken. In that instant, Lucas finally understood what the musket truly was. It was not a symbol of heroism or glory. It was a survival tool clutched by frightened human beings trapped inside a dying city, desperately trying to hold back something far larger than themselves. By dawn, smoke covered the skyline so completely that the rising sun appeared blood-red through the haze, and Vienna still stood, but only barely. Dawn brought no celebration to Vienna. The city had survived the night, but survival no longer felt like victory. Smoke drifted across the rooftops in heavy gray layers that dimmed the morning light and turned the streets into a landscape of ash, mud, and shattered stone. Fires still smoldered in damaged districts near the walls, while exhausted defenders wandered through the haze carrying empty water buckets, broken tools, and muskets blackened by constant use. The bells ringing across the city sounded slower now, weaker somehow, as though even the churches had grown tired. Lucas moved through the streets in silence beside other militia survivors after the fighting finally subsided near the breached defenses. Nobody spoke much anymore. The siege had drained something from the people inside Vienna that food and sleep alone could not restore. Everywhere he looked, the city carried visible scars. Windows had been boarded shut with splintered wood. Entire buildings leaned dangerously after weeks of bombardment. Public squares, once crowded with merchants and musicians, had become supply depots filled with powder barrels, wounded soldiers, and frightened civilians, waiting for news that never seemed to improve. The musket hung heavily against Lucas's shoulder as he walked. Its once dark wooden stock had become pale and rough from smoke, moisture, and constant handling. Burn marks stained part of the barrel near the muzzle, and the iron carried a faint reddish tint where rust had already begun forming beneath layers of soot. The weapon looked exhausted, just like the people carrying it. Yet Lucas still refused to let it out of reach. In his mind, the musket no longer belonged to the armory that issued it, or the unknown soldier who once carried it years before. It belonged to Vienna now. One afternoon, Lucas returned briefly to his family's apartment for the first time in days. Inside, the rooms felt strangely smaller than he remembered. Dust covered the furniture. Candles burned low beside the window where his mother sat silently staring toward the distant smoke beyond the rooftops. His younger sister slept wrapped in blankets near the wall, thinner than before, her face pale beneath the flickering light. Lucas leaned the musket carefully beside the doorway, and suddenly noticed how out of place it looked inside the apartment. Not heroic, not noble, just heavy, dirty, and frighteningly ordinary after weeks of siege. Outside, the city remained trapped in tension. Rumors spread constantly through the streets. Some claimed relief forces were drawing closer to Vienna. Others warned the defenders could not survive another major assault. Nobody knew which stories to believe anymore. Even time itself had begun to blur together beneath the smoke and exhaustion. Days passed, measured only by cannon fire, alarm bells, and the endless labor of repairing walls before nightfall. Then, several mornings later, the atmosphere inside Vienna changed almost instantly. At first, it was subtle. Defenders along the walls began pointing toward distant hills beyond the enemy camps. Church bells rang differently this time, not in panic, but in confusion. Soon, whispers spread rapidly through the streets that banners had been spotted in the distance. Allied relief forces were finally approaching the city. Lucas climbed partway onto the battered fortifications beside hundreds of exhausted defenders, staring through drifting smoke toward the horizon. Far away beyond the siege lines, movement flickered against the hills beneath the gray sky. Nobody cheered at first because nobody fully trusted what they were seeing. The siege had crushed certainty out of everyone inside Vienna. Yet as the hours passed, a strange feeling slowly returned to the city for the first time in weeks. Hope. Thin, fragile, uncertain hope. Lucas tightened his grip around the musket while smoke curled upward around the damaged walls, and somewhere deep inside him he realized that even if Vienna survived, the city that existed before the siege was already gone forever. The relief army finally arrived beneath dark September skies, and for the first time in weeks, the defenders of Vienna heard something other than cannon fire and collapsing stone. From the battered walls, Lucas watched distant banners moving across the hills, while church bells erupted across the city in wild celebration. Men embraced one another in exhaustion. Civilians wept openly in the streets. Some defenders dropped to their knees in prayer, while smoke still drifted over the ruined rooftops around them. Yet even as hope returned to Vienna, the city no longer felt alive in the way it once had. It felt wounded, hollowed out, as though the siege had carved something permanent into its soul. The fighting outside the walls continued for hours, but eventually the pressure surrounding Vienna began to break apart. Enemy camps that had surrounded the city for weeks slowly vanished into the distance beneath clouds of smoke and dust. By nightfall, exhausted defenders wandered through the streets, almost unable to process that the siege was truly ending. The silence afterward felt unnatural. There were no more underground explosions shaking the foundations, no more endless cannonades rolling through the darkness before dawn. Yet many people inside Vienna found themselves unable to sleep without those sounds. The city had lived too long beside fear. Lucas returned to the damaged walls one final time, carrying the musket beside him. Smoke still rose from ruined fortifications where shattered stone and burned timber lay scattered across the ground. Parts of the city beyond the defenses were barely recognizable anymore. Entire streets stood abandoned beneath layers of soot, while church towers disappeared into drifting gray haze. The smell of black powder still lingered in the air, despite the rain that had begun falling softly across Vienna that evening. Lucas stared down at the musket resting in his hands. The wooden stock was cracked near the trigger. Rust had spread across the iron fittings like dried blood beneath the soot. The barrel itself had slightly warped from repeated firing and heat. It no longer looked like a weapon fit for armies or empires. It looked tired, ancient, haunted. Around him, survivors moved slowly through the ruins, collecting supplies, searching for missing relatives, or simply staring silently at the damage left behind by weeks of siege. No songs filled the streets that night. No triumphant celebrations echoed across the city for long, because everyone understood something difficult to admit. Vienna had survived. But survival came at a cost that history books would later struggle to describe. Historians would write about strategy, alliances, kings, and empires. They would debate the importance of the siege and how it changed the balance of power across Europe. But those books could never fully capture what it felt like to sit awake in darkness, listening to enemy tunnels scraping beneath the earth below your home. They could never fully describe the exhaustion of loading a musket with trembling hands, while smoke covered the streets and church bells rang through the night. They could never explain how fear slowly transforms ordinary objects into something unforgettable. At some point after the siege ended, Lucas disappeared from historical records entirely. No document ever confirmed whether he survived the following years or died in another war somewhere along the empire's borders. The only thing that remained was the musket. Somehow it stayed behind, buried beneath collapsed stone and layers of earth as Vienna rebuilt itself over the centuries above it. Long after the fires vanished, long after the walls were repaired, long after the people who survived the siege were forgotten. And perhaps that is the most unsettling part of all. The weapon survived when the memory did not. Because even now, centuries later, historians still cannot say for certain who fired that final shot from the cracked musket before it disappeared beneath the ruins of Vienna forever.